Fight fans, welcome to the PBC Podcast, brought to you by Premier Boxing Champions with your host, Kenneth Bouhairie and Michael Rosenthal.
We are back here on the PBC Podcast. I'm Kenneth Bouhairie, and of course, my co-host, the editor of USA Today's Boxing Junkie, the distinguished Michael Rosenthal. We've got a lot to talk about. Obviously, another big fight weekend in boxing. Really, 2023 has been the year of the sweet science. It's just been so special. We're seeing nonstop event after event, big fights, great matchups, and a pretty good one last weekend. So without further ado, let's jump right into the week in review. Last Saturday from T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, Premier Boxing Champions brought you the Undisputed Welterweight Championship. It was the fight we've been clamoring for, the fight we've been arguing about for so many years. Errol Spence Jr. versus Terence Bud Crawford, two undefeated titleists, two of the best fighters in the world, pound for pound. What we saw was just a masterful performance from Mr. Crawford of Omaha, Nebraska, stopping Spence Jr. in the 9th round. Mike, what were your thoughts on the fight?
Well, a matchup that was spectacular on paper turned into a spectacular performance by Crawford. I didn't see it coming, at least not the way it unfolded. I just didn't see either of them, getting beat up like that, and that's pretty much what happened. I will always prefer a fight of the year candidate over a performance of the year candidate. But both of them can be breathtaking, and Crawford took my breath away on Saturday.
Yeah, I think no one saw that coming. I mean, there were so many different scenarios, but I wasn't expecting that. I was a little surprised by what I saw. How do you put Crawford's performance into words?
One word: brilliant. To appreciate what he did, you have to consider who his opponent was. Spence had universal respect. He was unbeaten. He was everybody's, among everybody's top few guys pound for pound. He's a future Hall of Famer for sure. And to be frank, Crawford just outclassed him. He just outboxed him, counterpunched brilliantly. And when he landed his punches, he hurt Spence. I mean, 3 knockdowns against Errol Spence. It sounds crazy. I think Crawford took firm control of the fight after only a few rounds, meaning at real early, I didn't see a path to victory for Spence. He was kind of lost. He just didn't know how to cope with what Crawford was throwing at him, which just boggles my mind again, because we're talking about Spence. Crawford's performance was one of the best I've seen in years. That's how impressed I was with his performance.
In your opinion, how significant was this accomplishment?
That I'm not a big fan of titles, which have lost their significance, at least to some degree, because there's just so many of them, almost 100 if you count all the secondary belts. This is different, though. Crawford winning all 4, belts makes him a real champion, like an old school champion. Ask anybody who follows boxing who the welterweight champion is right now, and they'll know, which is, it's really kind of become a thing of the past. That's special. On top of that, he became the first man to become undisputed in the 2nd division. That's just dominance any way you look at it. I'll add one thing. I lost sleep over the possibility that he'd never get the opportunity to truly prove himself. Thank goodness he did. Honestly, when he was asked how he felt about this and said he could cry at that moment, I was sort of fighting back tears myself. I was moved by what he did on Saturday and knowing what it meant to him.
Yeah, that, just a special night for him, and to become 2-time undisputed world champion, and kudos to both of these guys for making the fight happen. Where does Crawford stand on your pound for pound list?
Okay, I don't want to say I told you so. When I say you, I don't mean you in particular, but I don't want to say I told you so, but I told you so. I've had one number 1 fighter pound for pound since I joined Boxing Junkie in the fall of 2019. It's almost 4 years ago. And that fighter's Terence Crawford. When a lot of other outlets went with Canelo Alvarez, which I never understood. To this day, I don't get it. I stuck with Crawford when Inoue and Alexander Usyk crept up the list, became some people's number 1s. I stuck with Crawford because I always thought he was the best in the world, regardless of weight, which is what pound for pound is in my mind.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful I stuck with him. God knows I don't always get things right, but I believe I did in this case. The guy's the best in the world.
Yeah, as much as everything went right for him on Saturday night, it seemed like everything went wrong for Errol Spence. In your opinion, what happened there?
Real quick, I want to say something first. Spence couldn't have been classier afterward, which was no surprise. He used the term that I love to hear, no excuses. That's the kind of guy he is. What went wrong? I'll take his word for it to a good extent. I'll quote him. He said, quote, he was using his jab. My timing was a little bit off. He would just catch me in between shots, end quote. That's what happened. I don't want to attribute that to Spence's layoff or any other factor like that, though. The problem was Crawford. Crawford just waited for Spence to make a move and then countered more quickly and with more accuracy and power than Spence could handle. It was like Crawford knew what was coming every time and had an answer for it every time. And Spence just couldn't figure out how to adjust while he was under fire, which I have to acknowledge is a really, really difficult thing to do. As Spence said repeatedly, Crawford was just the better man that night. Yeah, he was just better.
Yeah. What do you think Errol should do? Should he exercise the rematch clause?
In my opinion, no. I understand why he would want to. Your instinct after suffering a beatdown like that is to prove that you could do better, that you could turn things around. And obviously there would be worse business decisions. I understand all that. At the same time, the result couldn't have been more conclusive. You normally wouldn't call for an immediate rematch under those circumstances, although some have. And another thing from Spence's perspective, if he loses like that again, and it's a decent chance that he would, how is he going to bounce back from 2 brutal losses in a row? It would be a huge unnecessary risk for him, even at a more comfortable 154 pounds, in my opinion. A rematch just doesn't feel right to me. At least an immediate rematch doesn't feel right to me right now.
Well, it seems like that's the path that he wants to take. In your opinion, what would he need to do in order to win that rematch?
Listen, Spence is a world-class boxer with a world-class trainer in Derek James. They will have reviewed the tape. They will have assessed what went wrong, and they'll take a different approach in the second fight. I read that George Foreman said Spence shouldn't have tried to box with a guy like Crawford. He should have fought more like a brawler. Foreman said, and I'll quote him, "You never box a boxer, you got to fight them," end quote. I think that would be a better strategy. After all that, though, do I think Spence could turn things around? No, I think Spence is special, but I think Crawford is better. Plus, I'm pretty sure Crawford is in Spence's head right now. How could he not be after what we saw on Saturday night? I'd pick Crawford to win again.
So if Spence doesn't opt for the rematch, then let's say, what do you think he should do next?
Well, I would take like a cautious conservative route if I were advising him. First, it seems clear that he plans to move up to 154. That's probably good. He won't have any trouble making weight. And there are good options for him in that division. He won't fight Jermell because they're close friends, but imagine Spence versus a Sebastian Fundora or Jesus Ramos or Tinsu or Brian Mendoza or Erickson Lubin. I get excited just, reeling off those names. Those are compelling, lucrative fights for him in the near future. I would start by fighting somebody maybe just below the top title contenders. I thought of Brian Castano, who gave Charlotte trouble. Maybe a guy like Terrell Gaucher, that kind of guy. Then build on that. And who knows? Maybe he fights Crawford at 54 somewhere down the line, just not now.
Yeah. Oh, who knows? Maybe that's the next fight at 54.
This is my perfect world.
Yeah. I think, but one thing's for sure, I don't think we see Errol Spence at 147 pounds again. It'd be interesting to see if we see Terence Crawford at 147 pounds again, and we'll touch on that in toe-to-toe when we list 5 potential opponents for him. Let's move on to the co-main event. Rising lightweight star Isaac Pitbull Cruz against Giovanni Cabrera. This was a WBC and WBA 135-pound title eliminator. Cruz winning a split decision, 12-round split decision over Cabrera. What were your thoughts on the fight, Mike?
Well, I thought Cruz won. He wasn't spectacular, but he was solid. Cabrera's movement, and holding, obviously frustrated Cruz to some degree, but he maintained pressure on Cabrera, and I thought just simply outworked the guy, in my opinion. He got the job done, which is the main objective. He remains near the top of the 135-pound rankings, meaning he's close to a title shot. I think that could happen within a few fights, depending on how things play out with Devin Haney and the other top guys. So I think he did what he came to do, which is win the fight. In my opinion, he won it clearly, and now he could look forward.
Well, you're saying he won it clearly, but it was a split decision. What did you think of the scorecards?
Terrible. So the scores were 115, 112, and 114, 113 for Cruz, and 114, 113 for Cabrera. I mean, that last card was 6 rounds apiece. I don't know what the last two judges were seeing. It seemed clear to me that Cruz got a lot more done in the fight, which is why I scored at 116, 111, which is 9 rounds to 3. And the CompuBox stats, which I know I'll always say aren't official, but they back me up. Cruz outlanded Cabrera 152 to 55 in power shots. I mean, come on, it was obvious. I mean, I just don't get it. Anyway, the good thing is that the right man won, which is always the most important thing.
Yeah, exactly. What did you make of Cruz's performance, though? I mean, we'd seen he'd been on a tear leading up to this fight, knocking out his last 3 or 4 opponents or so. Now he goes 12 rounds against the elusive Cabrera. What did you make of what you saw from Pitbull?
I think he was solid. Again, I think he was solid. I think that Cabrera is the kind of guy, he's athletic, he's quick, he's pretty crafty. He's the kind of guy that can give anybody problems. So he just, moved and held, and occasionally stopped and punched. It was just wasn't a great matchup for Cruz. But once again, he did what he came to do. He kept pressure on him. In my opinion, he landed many more punches, which is the objective. And I thought it was a solid performance. It's not a memorable performance. It's not a memorable fight, to be honest. But
right.
he got the job done. Now move on to bigger and better things.
Right. He did what he had to do. How about Cabrera, though? What's your take on him after seeing him for 12 rounds?
He's good. Again, his stick and move and hold tactics gave Cruz some problems. And it wasn't like Cabrera was just trying to survive. He engaged Cruz enough. He took enough risks to win a few rounds. And I agree, he did win a few rounds. He didn't come just to survive, in other words. And he has a good chin. That's another thing. I think he got rocked once or twice, but he took those punches and everything else Cruz threw at him, which is saying something. I think he's a good fighter. He's just not as good as Cruz. But I won't be surprised to see this guy in more big fights.
Yeah, I agree with you. What about Cruz, though? Who would you like to see him face next?
I just don't know exactly what to make of the lightweight division right now. He's sort of in a tough position because the championship picture is sort of on hold while Haney moves up to fight Regis Prograis. It's kind of a mess, in my opinion. So Cruz has to just stay busy and see how things play out. Frank Martin is in a similar position, I think. Would they be willing to fight each other? I doubt it, but that would be really interesting. Another guy I thought of was Edwin De Los Santos, if he wants to fight at 135. He's been fighting a little bit above 130 anyway. That could be a war. And who knows, maybe one of the sanctioning bodies will change Haney's status like the WBC just did, which would open the door for Cruz to fight for a title. I think that's coming pretty soon.
Yeah, and I like that Frank Martin matchup. I think that's a great headliner. Hopefully we see something like that. Now, also on the card, Nonito Donaire versus Alexandre Santiago. Donaire, of course, was the favorite, the legendary fighter heading into this fight. But we saw a very impressive performance from Santiago, winning a 12-round unanimous decision and picking up the vacant WBC bantamweight world title. Mike, what did you think of how Santiago did?
It's a good performance. I think he had a good, safe game plan, which was to outbox Donaire, and that's what he did. He outboxed him, he outworked him, and he was just a step ahead of, the older guy, from beginning to end, in my opinion. Congratulations to him. That was a breakthrough victory for him, one that's going to change his life. So I was impressed, and I was really happy for him.
Now, it's funny because for the first time I thought I saw, obviously, Donaire, what isn't the Filipino flash of that Donaire disappeared many, many years ago. But for the first time, I felt like I saw some age in Donaire. Where does he go from here?
I agree with what you just said. He didn't sound like a guy afterward who wants to retire, but maybe some thought will change his mind. Listen, he wasn't blown out. he can still fight at a pretty high level.
Sure.
I'll just say what you said in different words. I just don't think he's Nonito Donaire anymore. He's lost consecutive fights for the first time, including a brutal knockout against Naoya Inoue in his previous fight. Against Santiago, he was just a step slow. His reflex didn't seem to be quite the same. He said himself that he didn't let his hands go. That's typically a sign of decline. Your
Sure.
body not being able to do what your mind tells it to do. I would support whatever decision he makes, but I personally think enough's enough. How much more can this guy accomplish?
Yeah, I agree with you. And he did take a lot of shots, particularly later in the fight, which kind of bothered me. What about Santiago, though? What's next for him?
The trend now is to go after other title holders. That would be Takuma Inoue and Jason Maloney. Both of whom I think Santiago could beat, by the way. Or maybe he'll want to use his, newly won leverage by taking an easier fight, next to make some money. I don't know. There's a lot of options if he wants to do that. One fight I thought of was a rematch with Gary Antonio Russell, which certainly isn't easier. Russell beat him by a disputed decision in 2021. I think he'd like to avenge that loss. That's a possibility, and I'm sure that I know that Russell would be interested in that. Anyway, when you win titles like this, you have a lot of options. Santiago has options.
Yeah. I like the Russell fight. I think that's a good fight, and also challenging the other world champion. Speaking of which, the man who beat Gary Russell, Emmanuel Rodriguez, who's fighting next week, if he's able to get by Melvin Lopez, or just the winner of that fight, because that fight's for the vacant IBF Bantamweight World Championship, that would be a good opponent for Santiago as well, and be a good unification. So either way, that young man has options, and he certainly deserved it. Now, in the pay-per-view opener, we had a great matchup between prospect and veteran. Yoenis Tellez being the prospect, Sergio Garcia being the veteran. 10-round super welterweight matchup, and boy, did we get a shock. Garcia typically durable, but Tellez, after a competitive first 2 rounds, landed a couple big right hands in the third and knocked Garcia out. How surprised were you at this outcome?
The only thing that surprised me was Tellez's dominance. I picked him to win, but I thought the fight was going to be competitive, given Garcia's ability and his experience, the edges he had in that regard. Tellez just caught him with a big shot and finished the job. Garcia was overwhelmed, by what appears to be just a better fighter.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on this young guy after seeing him?
I was really impressed. I was impressed by just seeing what I saw on YouTube videos. I was really impressed by seeing him in this fight. I thought he boxed well and with a lot of poise before the knockout. He certainly didn't look like a guy with only 5 fights. And he obviously has power. Garcia lost, as you alluded to, to Sebastian Fundora and Tony Harrison, but he went the distance with both of those guys. Tellez needed less than 3 rounds. This kid has something. I think he'll be in big fights sooner rather than later.
So who'd you like to see him face next?
Honestly, I think he could handle a contender right now. I mean, probably a fringe contender. A fight I like is Tellez versus Joey Spencer. It's one I thought of. That's not a reach for Tellez, and Spencer would be really motivated, I think, coming off his first setback. I think he might be able to. I think that Tellez might be able to hang with guys like Danny Garcia and Sebastian Fundora and Brian Castano right now, but I would wait. My conservative nature when it comes to this stuff. Get him a little bit more experience, but I think the ability's there.
Yeah, but I'm with you. I think you further develop this guy, and I like the Spencer matchup. I love the style matchup there. I think that'd be an all-out war. So, again, another fighter with lots of options. And speaking of options, let's jump right into toe-to-toe. All right, it's time for Mike and I to go toe-to-toe. And this week, following on the theme of last weekend's big fight, we are going to discuss 5 potential opponents for Undisputed Welterweight Champion Terence Bud Crawford. And we'll start with number 5. I think the most obvious one, obviously, is an Errol Spence Jr. rematch. Mike, we sort of touched on it a little bit before in the week in review, but give us your thoughts on that.
Well, again, if they said I get to make the decision, I would say no, let's wait. But it definitely would be an interesting matchup. I mean, the obvious question is whether Spence could make the adjustments necessary to turn things around. Excuse me. It would be interesting to see if he could do that. And it looks like the rematch would take place at 154. That's also an intriguing factor. Spence might be a lot more comfortable at that weight, which could work in his favor. And Crawford, he's a naturally smaller guy, would be moving up another weight class. You'd think there would be diminishing returns at some point for him as he continues to move up. And in spite of what we saw on Saturday, Spence is still an elite fighter. And elite fighters sometimes surprise us. So I probably wouldn't choose a rematch, but I definitely would want to see this fight.
Yeah, and I think at 154 things does get a little bit different. And also, if there's a fairly quick turnaround as well, I mean, Errol Spence had one fight in 3 years. So, maybe this fight, for better or worse, knocked off some ring rust. Let's move on to the next potential option for Terence Crawford. This at welterweight or above, depending on how these two guys feel. But I think it's just a great welterweight matchup, and that's Keith one-time Thurman. I've heard Crawford's trainer Brian Bomack, I should say that they would love a shot at Thurman. What do you make of that fight?
Well, first, I think they said that because they know that it's a really good business decision. Thurman's a well-known guy, former title holder. He's got a great personality, great talker, so I think it'd be a really good promotion. And in terms of the competitive nature, I think people might be overlooking Thurman to some degree, because he's been relatively inactive. He's had only one fight the past 4 years. And I think there might be a perception that he might be, a little bit past his prime, basing that largely on a split decision loss to 40-year-old Manny Pacquiao in 2019. Now you have to remember he was battling injuries, leading up to that fight, injuries that have interrupted his career in general. He evidently is healthy now. He looked good in his one-sided decision over Mario Barrios in February of last year, which was his most recent fight. And he's only 34. He's younger than Crawford, who's 35. And don't forget, the guy's lost only once in his entire career, the Pacquiao fight. The guy does definitely have credentials. Could Thurman beat Crawford? I don't think so, but he's a legitimate opponent who could pose some problems for Crawford if he's at his best, but he'd have to be at his very best.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think he's another guy who I'd like to see take a tune-up before he were to fight Terence Crawford. He's been out of the ring for a little bit, and I don't know if Terence Crawford's the kind of guy you want to jump right back in there with. But then again, Thurman is well preserved. I saw him last week. He looks great. Looks like he's in fighting shape already. So, hey, who knows? Maybe he's ready for Crawford now. Now, another 147-pounder, perhaps the best of the bunch, Jaron Boots Ennis against Terence. Can you imagine that fight, Mike? I mean, that would be just insane.
Yeah, I think this is the matchup fans are talking about, hardcore fans who understand what Ennis is capable of. Ennis doesn't have the track record of Spence, but he aces any eye test he could possibly produce. He's the only welterweight who can match Crawford's speed, power, and explosiveness, maybe even exceed it to some degree. I don't know. And he obviously has technical ability, although he hasn't proved it against one of the, the top handful of guys at 147 pounds. Now, I would pick Crawford to beat any welterweight or junior middleweight at the moment, including Jermell Charlo. For me, that's a given. It was probably a given before Saturday, but it's definitely a given now. The goal should be to find the man who poses the most significant threat. That would be Ennis, in my opinion. He's a physical freak who has the ingredients to be a truly special, maybe even a truly great fighter. And he's 26. He's 9 years younger than Crawford, and he's definitely in his physical prime. No other potential 147-pound matchup even compares to this one, in my opinion.
Yeah, he may be even a better switcher than Crawford. He may be more powerful. I don't know if he's as quick, but he's certainly got great hand speed. And not to mention his size. He's just built like a middleweight. Yet he's able to make that 147-pound limit comfortably, and we saw what he could do against a tough, rugged opponent. I love that matchup, but as you sort of alluded to, I don't know if it's quite marinated. I know fight fans hate that word, but I just feel like it would be so much bigger, even later.
I agree 100%.
Yeah, I will see. I'll take that fight now, later, whenever. Let's jump up to the super welterweight division, 154 pounds. WBO title holder, the interim WBO title holder there is Tim Tszyu. Just heard from the WBO that after Jermell Charlo's fight with Canelo Alvarez, that they will likely strip him of that title, which would make Tszyu the full champion. And let's keep in mind now that Crawford is a WBO super champion, so he'd get an automatic shot at that title at 154. Imagine that, Terence Crawford versus Tim Tszyu.
I hadn't really thought about that matchup. It's definitely a really fascinating matchup. I think Tszyu and Crawford have one thing in common, maybe more than one thing. They're both like really fiery guys with a nasty side to them in a killer instinct. They're both like really good finishers. I love that about both guys. And Tszyu would have a clear size advantage. I think of him as a particularly strong, physical, 154-pounder. And he's obviously also a skillful boxer. I think the problem for Tszyu is the disparity in talent between him and Crawford, which let's face it, is a problem for everybody. Who would step into the ring with Crawford. I think the same things that gave Spence trouble, the boxing ability, the speed, the explosiveness, and everything else, I think would be a lot for Tszyu to handle. I just don't think he would have the all-around ability to hang with Crawford, even with the size advantage. But that said, this guy's a really big, strong, good fighter. That's a really, really interesting matchup.
Yeah, I love that matchup. I just, it's an interesting clash of styles, and who knows what the size difference could mean for Terence Crawford fighting a guy that quick. And Tzew's not slow in there, especially when he puts his punches together. He's pretty quick, pretty cerebral fighter. So I just think it's a great fight. But I think the greatest matchup, which we may not see, because this young man is moving up to super middleweight to take on Canelo Alvarez. But the fight that Terence Crawford says he wants is a 154-pound showdown versus the undisputed champion, Jermell Charlo. Mike, what are your thoughts on that fight?
Well, first, I think Charlo's made it clear that his plan is to come back down to 54. So I'm hopeful that we'll see him back there. Well, that's the fight. Crawford against Charlo. This would be Crawford's toughest fight at 154 and below. Charlo can't match Ennis in terms of the speed and explosiveness, in my opinion. And I'm not sure even Crawford can, but he's really not that far behind. On top of that, he has elite punching power. I mean, Charlo's like almost like a knockout artist. And like Tszyu, he'd have a size advantage over Crawford. Remember, Crawford started at 135 pounds, and he'd be facing a guy who was about to face a 168-pounder in Canelo Alvarez. All that adds up to a tough fight for Crawford. I learned a long time ago that it's generally best to go with the more talented guy when making a prediction. So I'd pick Crawford to win this fight, but I'm not as confident as I am with the other guys on this list. Not confident at all. I guess it's obvious, but Charlo has a legitimate chance to beat Crawford if he's on his A game. I'd absolutely love to see that fight.
Yeah, me too. I think that's also one of the best fights that could be made in boxing. I mean, Jermell Charlo, 154, also future Hall of Famer, one of the best fighters in the world, an entirely different beast to anyone at 147. So if it does happen, I will be glued to the TV. I'm sure all of us will be, but all of these potential fights are great. We're just going to wait and see what the Undisputed Welterweight Champion decides to do next. But for now, that'll do it for this week's show. Be sure to check us out next week for more boxing talk, more banter, right here on the PBC Podcast.